So they wrote that they shouldn't, meaning translators, they shouldn't have added anything to scripture, even if it was well intended, as it's created misunderstanding and downgrade harm. Um, I mean, I partially agree with this. What do you guys think about this?
Good, Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. We have to be extremely careful with that. Um, but at the same time, if we can't just translate things literally every time because we will end up not understanding what's being talked about. Because if we just there's some ideas of translation where people want to take the same word in Hebrew or Greek and use every and translate it with the same word in English every time.
Mhm.
And that helps us in some sense to see the patterns in scripture, which are really important. Um, like it, Robert Alter has a really good translation of the Hebrew Bible, and he tries to do that to the best of his ability so that we can see those patterns. However, there's a limit to that because we have to be able to understand what the text is saying, and there's so many idioms and so many words that don't have a one-to-one correspondence. You can't just uh, take the same word every time and translate it the same way every time because
Mhm.
people will load those English associations into that word every time and they're not necessarily there in the text.
Right.
So, this is why I suggest, highly suggest, reading multiple translations,
Yep.
never just reading one translation, because if you're using multiple translations, um, then you will likely come to the point of seeing these differences. Now, not every translation is different. You have translations that are more literal,
Mhm.
translations that are more of a paraphrase, translations that kind of try and hit in a middle there.
Mhm.
And there's lots of charts online for types of translations. So I suggest finding those and making sure that you're reading some translations from the more literal side and some translations from the more paraphrase side, because then you'll really get this kind of good mix of trying to understand and dig into what the meaning of the text is rather than just what the words of the text are. But
Right.
to some degree, it's impossible to prevent some biases. So that's why we have to have multiple
Yeah.
translations.
I don't know if anybody's read Young's literal translation, but it's practically unreadable, but it is word for word.
Yeah.
And there has to be some. You're right. We can't avoid the bias of writing in our theological baggage into a translation, but it's impossible to do a translation from one language to another without having to make some decisions where you're losing data or trying to explain some data that doesn't make sense on its own. So, I mean, I agree with Carrie that it's to say we shouldn't add anything, shouldn't take anything away. Well, how granular are you going to apply that expectation? And it's very difficult. So
And we got
Yeah.
to ask ourselves why it matters too, right? Again, two part. My church has a significant Arabic congregation, and so the Old Testament Hebrew and the Aramaic parts are kind of easy for them because you're in the same language family, right? Of
mm,
course, there's still choices, but it's pretty easy to get a literal translation there because it's close and you carry a lot of the same meaning. Our Arabic pastor finds Greek much more difficult, whereas some languages it's going to be the other way around.
yeah,
Orthodox churches, a lot of Orthodox churches work with the Greek a lot because they're in related languages and that's their mainstay. Even for the Old Testament, they'll use the Septuagint, the Greek translation, instead of the other ones, and so they carry the sense of what's going on. I think you can read any reasonably faithful translation and get to the point of who Jesus is and salvation, right?
yes,
That should be carried no matter what. This is secondary teaching and doctrine kind of stuff.
yes,
It's not the core thing. And so we have to pick and choose, but you also have to ask how important it is. There are some translations or especially paraphrases that can be pretty misleading, I think. But, as long as you're trying to be honest about the work you're doing, it's going to be okay, but it's good to compare.